Namaste to you all. First of all, let me introduce myself. I am S. Ravi Advocate, one of the trustees of Voice for Justice. Voice for Justice is an NGO based out of Chennai and has eminent persons as trustees. Voice for Justice is concerned with the protection of human rights and ensuring justice for those whose rights are infringed. We take up issues concerning violation of human rights in order to find out the root cause of the incident, analyze them in order to avoid their recurrence, as well as to make suggestions to protect the human rights. For this, we identify people of social standing such as retired judges of the High Court and Supreme Court, reputed lawyers, retired IAS and IPS officials, and other prominent persons, and involve them to take up the most needed social legal activities to study the problem, propose remedial measures, and help to tackle the cases of violation of human rights and any consequent danger to social peace and harmony. Now, we'll approach the problem in a little unique way in the sense that we appoint a team of extremely eminent specialists in the respective fields related to the problem, undertake a scientific investigation, analyze the data thus obtained, and make recommendations to the appropriate forum for redressal stroke removal of the problem. This is a unique speciality of Voice for Justice. We do not normally compete with other human rights organizations, and our area of focus will be deprivation of human rights and democratic rights of ordinary citizens. Some of the major projects which we have undertaken is the first is the electronic voting machine. During 2010, major political parties had indulged in a disinformation campaign against electronic voting machines. In order to create awareness among the general public about the viability and efficacy of electronic voting machines, we conducted a seminar in which the advantages of using electronic voting machines are highlighted. Mr. T.S. Krishnamurthy, former Chief Election Commissioner, Naresh Gupta, Chief Electoral Officer of the state, and an engineer from Bharat Electronics participated, and the functions of the electronic voting machine was demonstrated. This was done to create awareness among the general public about the advantages of using EVMs during election process. One of the major projects undertaken by us is what is known as the Love Jihad. In the year 2010, several reports appeared in newspapers in the state of Kerala regarding well-educated girls studying in professional courses being lured and ultimately cheated in the name of love. The incident came to light pursuant to a bail petition filed before the Kerala High Court. These types of incidents not only occurred in Kerala, but there are similar complaints from other parts of the country. All this drew the attention of human rights activists throughout the country, and Voice for Justice, which is a pioneer, took cognizance and decided to constitute a fact-finding committee so that the real picture could be brought to the notice of the public. The fact-finding team comprised of Justice Surendra Bhargava, former Chief Justice of the High Court of Sikkim, Mr. T.S. Roy, former Director General of Police of the Government of Andhra Pradesh, and Sri Bhusharan Gill, former Additional Advocate General of the Government of Rajasthan. The committee held several sittings in Cochin after interviewing several victims, submitted a report to the Governor of Kerala. And to our credit, our report was relied upon in the Supreme Court when a matter of similar nature came up quite recently. One of the major projects conducted by us during 2014 prior to the general elections is what is known to be a voter. We found that most of the intelligentsia, especially among the IT sector, do not register themselves as voters and they do not come to vote. So we conducted a campaign to create awareness among the general public about the necessity to vote and exercise their franchise in general election. The website and the style of beavoter.in was created, and in recognition of our work, the Election Commission of India recognized us as the authorized representative to educate the general public and to conduct campaign to create awareness to participate with enthusiasm in the electoral process. The election commission requested publicity materials, audio and video recorded messages for the use of Voice for Justice. The highlight of the campaign was a seminar conducted in March 2014 in which Mr. Ajit Doval, presently National Security Advisor, participated and gave a speech on national security. It was also attended by Mr. Venkatesh Prabhu Patil, Lieutenant General in the Indian Army. Every year, we have also been celebrating the International Human Rights Day, in which eminent speakers are invited to speak on human rights. So far, Justice Nagamuthu, Justice M.M. Sundaresh, and Justice Anand Venkatesh, judges of the Madras High Court, have participated and delivered keynote address. Now, one of the objectives of Voice for Justice is to make an effort to generate an enlightened debate on issues that concern the society. The present webinar is one such attempt. Voice for Justice will be an excellent forum for men and women with integrity and a strong sense of nationalist feelings who want to work in the field of human rights. We solicit such persons to join and be a part of our efforts. Please visit our website www.voiceforjustice.in. Now, coming to today's webinar, I have great pleasure in introducing Mr. N. Venkatraman, Senior Advocate. He graduated in law from the Madurai Law College, and incidentally, he was my classmate. He is a specialist in indirect taxation and was a junior to the legendary late C. Natarajan. He has given several lectures on various topics like the Ayodhya verdict, abolition of Article 370, Sabarimala, etc. The topic of today's webinar, as you all know, is CAA, a citizen's perspective. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Act is one of the most misinterpreted provision of law that had dominated the national debate for the past few months prior to the pandemic. Self-appointed guardians of human rights and political activists, both India and abroad, have seized the opportunity to sow seeds of division and create a fear psychosis among the Indian citizens. The present speech by Mr. Venkatraman will be an attempt to dispel the myths surrounding the legislation and to give a clear picture about the background leading to the legislation. I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to this webinar, and I once again thank Mr. Venkatraman for accepting our invitation to give this speech. Thank you. Over to Mr. Venkatraman.
Namaste Sharade Devi, Kashmira Puravasini, Twamaham Pratyage Nityam, Vidyadhanancha Dehime, Annapurne Sadapurne Shankara Pranavallave, Jnana Vairagya Siddhyartham Bhikshan Dehi Cha Parvati. My college mate and my moot colleague in college, Ravi, Voice for Justice, and citizens of India, and well wishes. It's a happy moment as we share a very important topic for discussion. Before I venture to speak, I should give a small backdrop as to how we came into this subject for preparation. As Gurumurthy sir spoke to us and said that we should work on this subject and more from a legal and a constitutional perspective. We thank him for putting us into this job. And a team of 10 people headed by Dr. Vaidya Subramaniam, Vice Chancellor of Shastra University, and 4 advocates, Amrit, Jayalakshmi, Aryaman, and Chandrasekhar Bharati, and 5 interns who are students of the Shastra University, Shivashankar, Sarva Ishwaran, Aryan Atreya, Meenakshi Raman, and Amrita Chandrabauli. 11 of us sat for over 3 to 4 weeks, sifting through various documents, which are all available in public domain, including international protocols, including international studies on human rights, and mapped how this happens, this demographic change happens all over the world, and what is unique about India, and why this law has therefore been passed. So with this backdrop, I thank once again my classmate Ravi for reposing confidence in me. We were together in several mood competitions 30 years back. We spent a lot of time together. I'm happy to be sharing a platform along with him one more time today. Thanks, Ravi. And thanks, Swaminathan, for supporting us in this event to host it. Dear citizens, we need to know a few things which are basic facts which are not disputed. Every government in power from 1950 to 2020, whether it was a single party rule or a coalition government, any form of government, have all, during their regime, while preparing reports for the government, have in unison said that illegal migrants is a great challenge to India. And this has to be dealt in one way or the other. And an NRC was recommended, including national identity cards. There was not a single party of governance at any point of time who has opposed it. This is one fact. Now, the second fact, these various reports which travel for about 7 decades have culled out certain quintessence of this problem relating to illegal migrants. And what are they? One, these reports suggest that it is posing a huge border security issue. Two, it poses an internal security issue from the security angle. Now, when it comes to the local natives, it says the following, that there is enormous pressure on the local natives because of this exodus. One, they start occupying land and natural resources in the process. Two, three, they slowly render the local natives irrelevant and redundant. And cumulatively, there is a huge increase in the population size from the exodus community. This is the 4 aspects documented in various government reports. The impact of illegal migration. And finally, the third part, it says, this leads to nefarious activities, smuggling, terror activities, and in the eastern border, the smuggling value of goods, merchandise, commodities, and actions almost 3 times than the normal trade. So this is the basic background of people exoding into our country. Now, the second part which we should know before we move forward to understand what is the CAA is, what does the citizenship law of this country say? We brought a citizenship law only in the year 1955. So the question is, what happened to those people prior to that? Prior to that, there were 2 dispensations. People who were born in that unified India governed by the Government of India Act 1935 were considered to be citizens of India. Then after the mass migration and resultant genocide, resultant killing of millions of people because of partition, in 1948, a window was opened, allowing people to return, who were the very same 6 communities, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Christians, and Parsis. And in the case of Muslims, they were permitted to come back with a process where if they have their own dwelling unit and they have a relation to India before their migration. So this was the structured permit that was in, and which was in vogue in 1948. So these 2 clusters formed the basis for citizenship. besides those who are born in India. Then it traveled into three parts. Between 1950 and 1987, children born in India out of illegal parents were considered to be citizens of India. For 37 years, that was the law. And between 1987 and 2004, children born to illegal parents, one of them being Indian and the other being illegal, were still considered to be citizens of India. And post 2004, children should be born to legitimate parents, both of them being in India, or at least one of them should not be an illegal migrant. So much of talk transpired, views transpired, poor children, what will they do because of the CAA? It's so draconic and so lethal. But remember, for 54 years, we have been regularizing their citizenship in India because of this law called the Citizenship Act. And is 54 years, which is almost 2 generations, is it not sufficient? And why do we need more? This is one question. Before we travel into this amendment, we must know the history behind it. So these 3 clusters ensured children born were granted citizenship. And for 54 years, this was the law. Now, in 2014 or in 2019-20, where we brought this CAA, it only said these 6 communities, if they have entered India before 2014 and have been in India for 5 long years, instead of 11 years tenure, it is shortened to 5 years, they will become citizens. And the criteria was, they were all people who were persecuted in the name of religion or suffering the fair causes of persecution in the name of religion. So this is the travel journey or the chart when it comes to the date timelines for citizenship. Of course, there is one more in 66 and 71. When it comes to that juncture, when it's relating to Bangladesh, I'll refer it to it. So this forms the basis of the citizenship law in the country. And you can be granted citizenship under the Indian Citizenship Act, either through the process of, say, birth or descent, or by registration, or by naturalization. These are the 4 methods. And these practices are all well-recognized global practices. Even today, naturalization is there. Even last year, about 2,800, 2,900 people were naturalized, of which majority, many Muslims, including from Pakistan, have been naturalized. These are all statistics available on record. Now, before we understand why CAA was passed, as citizens, you must be aware, you must be made known what Supreme Court has expressed its view on this subject of citizenship, on the subject of illegal migrants. There are 3 important milestone decisions. The first judgment was delivered in 2005 in the Sonawal 1 case. What is the backdrop? Now, when the Bangladesh war was fought and Bangladesh became independent in 1971, a peace treaty was entered into, a friendly peace treaty was entered into between both countries in 1972 by the prime ministers of both countries. And what was agreed was, those people who came into India from Bangladesh, who are native Indian origin, prior to 1966 January, will be deemed to be citizens of India. And for those who entered India between 66 and 71, will have to identify themselves, or if they are found to be illegal migrants, they need to go through a waiting process of 10 years, after which citizenship will be regularized. But those who had entered post 1971 will be declared as illegal. So this was the treaty entered into. And one statistics all of us should bear it in mind. Between 1961 and 1965, India has deported more than 1.5 lakh illegal migrants out of India to Bangladesh. This is reported in the 2015 judgment of the Supreme Court. So between 61 and 65, more than 1.5 lakhs. Some report says 4.5, but I remember this to be 1.5 lakhs into Bangladesh. So any entry post 1971, both countries have concurred that it will be treated as illegal migrants only, and therefore need to be deported. But what was happening? Nothing was happening. And that is why it resulted in the Assam Accord in 1985. Because the major pressure is on Assam and the 6 neighboring states of Northeast. So Assam Accord was passed on 15th August 1985 to deal with this situation. And this Section 6A was introduced, Citizenship Act, giving all this regularization. But very interestingly, most of the citizens may not know, 2 years prior to 1985, in 1983, the then Union government passed a legislation called the IMDT Act 1983. And what did it do? See, in India, dealing a foreigner is through the 2 enactments, principal enactment. One is the Foreigners Act 1946 and the Entry of the Passport Act 1920. So if somebody enters into India without a valid passport, then he is declared to be illegal. And the Foreigners Act 1946 permits a foreigner to come into India in a proper way. And if he overstays, then he becomes illegal. If he comes with a forged document, he becomes illegal. If he somehow sneaks into India without any documentation, it becomes illegal. And therefore, the law permits the central government to deport them because they're illegal. So these were the 2 legislations governing India. And it applied to the whole of India. And what did it say? The burden will be on the illegal migrant to prove that he is staying in India legally, which is very natural. See, somebody has to, if you are a culprit, you have to show that you are not a culprit. So the burden was always on the person who is accused of being an illegal migrant. Now, what did they do through this law, which is a union law in 1983, is they amended through this law, they brought out an exception only for Assam. So rest of India, burden will be on the illegal migrant. Whereas in Assam alone, burden of proof will be with the central government. So they shifted the burden from the illegal migrant to the government and restricted this applicability only to the state of Assam, which had the maximum strenuous pressure out of this illegal migration. But remember, this act came in 1983. But the Supreme Court had to finally declare this act to be invalid and unconstitutional only in 2005. So for 22 years, this act virtually disabled deportation of illegal migrants in the northeastern states from and out of India. Who says this? The Supreme Court says this. You have made the law so cumbersome, so difficult to comply, that you have encouraged more and more of exodus of illegal migrants into the country. Now, what happened in this 22 years period? This is recorded by the Supreme Court through various criteria. It documents what are the push factors allowing people to migrate from Bangladesh into India. 1, huge exponential increase of population in Bangladesh. 2, enormous pressure on the landmass. And 3, agricultural was a failing industry and there was absolutely no clues as to how the economy would revive and prosper into a big nation. So these three factors pushed people out of Bangladesh into India. What are the pull factors? Supreme Court records. Porous borders. You can enter freely into India because nobody was there to stop you. Most difficult process of identification. That's the second criteria. And more importantly, absolute better economic opportunities for them to prosper in India. See, whatever we now share is all found in the decision of the Supreme Court. It's not some newspaper report or a media report or a thought process or a writer's view. It's all there in the Supreme Court judgment. Now, the third criteria the Supreme Court seeks to discuss is what are the affected territories because of this? And the Supreme Court records the border districts adjoining Bangladesh are the worst affected of this, especially border districts of Assam and West Bengal. And they found and recorded a fact: extraordinary, unusual, above national average population growth was found significantly in these districts. They found out Hindus growing at say 40-42% and Muslims going at 71 to 75% per year because of this exodus into India. And that's why if you see the northeastern states, some of them are actually more Muslim majority states. All this because of this 25 years of non-care is what Supreme Court seeks to say. Now, what are the type of migrants who came? People who came with a valid passport initially under the Foreigners Act 1946 but overstayed. People who came with forged documents and people who sneaked through the porous borders of India into India. These are the three types of people. So finally, what did Supreme Court declare after hearing this? Here is an interesting fact which we must all know. The then government, the union government in 2000 and the state government in 2001 activated the process of hearing this matter. And in their counter affidavits filed before the Supreme Court, they have given reasons as to why this act needs to be abolished and held to be unconstitutional. But in 2001, there was a change in power in the Assam government. Once there was a change in government, the government immediately withdrew the earlier affidavit and filed a new affidavit supporting and continuing this legislation. They wanted the legislation to continue. And in 2004, again, when there was a change in government in the center, the government filed a revised affidavit holding that this act has to be held constitutional. But in 2005, in spite of the change in stand because of the change in government, the Supreme Court proceeded to declare this act as unconstitutional and ultra vires for the following reasons. It did not recognize the revised affidavits filed subsequently in 2001 and 2004 and went by the old affidavits and said that conveys the proper stand and declared the law to be bad. And what did they say in the process? One, it asked a question: when in the whole of India, burden of proof is with the illegal migrant, why should a reverse proof be insisted only in the state of Assam? What is its basis? Especially when the pressure is enormous only in that state. Two, it said, going by the reports, the identification process was virtually impossible. Detection and deportation was such a cumbersome process that it never happened. Three, arbitrary powers were given to the screening committees and no appeals were provided against their decisions. Four, police officers were not enabled to go and do the searches in the houses and find out and identify people for deportation. 5, more than 85% of the inquiries were rejected as invalid, and it did not go for any reference or a consideration. 6, Supreme Court records the fact this exodus has resulted in such an enormous pressure that where did these people, what lands did they occupy? They occupied barren lands, cultivable lands, and forest areas, besides exploitation of natural resources. 7, it said, any person who was found to be an illegal migrant will suddenly become untraceable. And in 2015 judgment, in fact, Justice Nariman puts out the question very clearly. When you can deport between 61 and 64, 1.5 lakh people to Bangladesh, citizens should know between 1983 and 2005, about 1,200 people were deported ultimately out of India. When the exodus was in lakhs and the population increased in crores, only 1,000 and odd people were actually deported because it was such a cumbersome process. Because of a legislation which was passed in 1983, 2 years before the Assam Accord. And therefore, it finally made the Supreme Court to declare a very, very important principle of law. It said, an exodus of this intensity has to be termed as an internal disturbance and also an external aggression. Therefore, it breaches the mandate of Article 355. Every central government has to protect its states, more so the border states, from external aggression and the whole of India from internal disturbance. It is centers, unions' responsibility. Now, this 25 years of lackluster effort has resulted in an external aggression and an internal disturbance. And therefore, this is directly hit by Article 355. In fact, this question is now before the larger bench in 2015, where they have expanded the scope of this external and internal, whether it will also include cultural invasion, whether it will also include ethnic invasion, native invasion. So they want to examine, they don't want to confine it only to territory or demography. They want to also deal with people. That's the question proposed by Justice Nariman's bench for the larger constitutional bench to decide it. So this is the impact this legislation made, and it was struck down. But the story didn't stop there. What happened in 2005 was, the moment this legislation was struck down, the matters were going back under the Foreign Tribunals Act, Foreigners Act 1946, and the tribunal constituted under that act through an order. Immediately, the Union government passed 2 subordinate legislations, getting over the Supreme Court judgment, restoring the same IMDT Act, and putting the burden on the government when it comes to state of Assam. They did the very same thing to executive orders or through subordinate legislation, which Supreme Court in 2007 again stuck it down, and it finally conveyed displeasure, saying that looks to be that there is lack of will on the part of the governments to do deportation of illegal migrants. So these are the 2 important judgments. And the third one is this 2015 Assam Samilita Mahasangh judgment, where 3 questions are posed by the Honorable Supreme Court. 1, when you can do 1.5 lakhs in 60s, how come Assam Accord is signed in 1985? In 2015, it is 30 years. After 30 years, how come you have only deported less than 2,000 people? This was one question posed by the court. And 2, when you could fence the whole of the western border, which is about 3,300 kilometers, and make it non-porous, what was the difficulty in not fencing the eastern border, which is 4,000 kilometers, and making it porous and allowing illegal migrants to come into India. Therefore, before we embark on this law and its mechanism, whether it's right, sane, insane, violation, all that human rights, all that which we will discuss in the next few minutes, we should understand this was the state of affairs of illegal migrants in India as decided and declared by the Honorable Supreme Court. We should not go by anything else. These are all judgments, recorded judgments, and available for anybody's reading in public domain. Okay. Now, of course, all of them are illegal migrants. The first immediate trigger will come is all are illegal migrants. Now, what made you a basis to decide some will be citizenship and rest have to be deported when Supreme Court has declared everybody as illegal migrants? That will be the first counter to these three judgments, for which we need to understand what international protocols speak. Starting from United Nations, India is not a signatory, but India does comply with all its fairness, the international standards, because our constitution says the best practices, global best practices can always be adopted to, as long as it doesn't conflict with our constitutional values. Therefore, what do they say? These protocols very clearly say, if somebody flees out of a country into another nation because of fearing persecution, or in fact being persecuted on the basis of religion, caste, ethnic, nationality, etc., he can be considered for a refugee status. See, internationally, there are a few terms which we should be very familiar with. Citizenship is something which there is no international citizenship as of now anywhere in this world. Citizenship is always something to do with a sovereign nation's right. It can decide who should be citizens, who should not be citizens. And after going through 80 plus countries citizenship law, we can fairly be convinced to convey you the information that our laws are at par, are in fact better standards. The kind of criteria that is being placed by some nations, very obscure, whereas our process of naturalization and registration are fairly simple. After comparing 80 countries, we are making this statement to you. So, citizenship is always a sovereign right. Each nation will take a call what it needs, who should be its citizens. But when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers, protocols insist. So who is an asylum seeker? An asylum seeker is a person who applies himself to be a refugee. His application is under process. And when somebody's application gets processed and is declared as a status as a refugee, he becomes a refugee of that nation. And each nation is requested, because that is something evolved out of the human rights. Human rights demand, give them refugee status, people who get persecuted for one reason or the other. Therefore, though there is illegal migrancy into India, international protocols mandate, which India also wants to follow, if there are any persecution, if people have come into India because of persecution in the name of religion, in the name of X, Y, Z, then give them a refugee status. So, even though they may be illegal migrants, they are entitled to, under the human rights value, a status of a refugee. So, India can also extend that benefit, which India has been extending. One instance is this SOP rules, Standard Operating Procedure Rules 2011, which is all for if you are persecuted for XYZ reasons and you put a valid application, there's a process. Then India will clear that application if it is in accordance with its requirements and grant somebody a refugee status. So it is in vogue. Now, therefore, even though they are illegal, from a humanitarian angle, they can be given this status, is what international protocols say. Now, what has India done today? When international protocols say you can give them refugee status, India has chosen to take a bold step, maybe a step by example to the world. Those who are persecuted in the name of religion or fear such a persecution, we will make them citizens of our nation. It's an exercise which a very brave step taken by a country which other countries may have to at some point of time, because it is an extension of human rights value only. How does it become inhuman? So it's an extension of a human rights value that this legislation says these 6 communities are persecuted communities, and therefore let us extend them citizenship into India by reducing their 11-year gestation period into 5 years. Of course, every legislation will have a cutoff date. You can't find all cutoff dates have been approved, validated by Supreme Court under various legislations. Because you must have somebody will be on this side and somebody will be on the other side. You can't be somewhere. You have to draw the line. So that has always passed the test of threshold of not being very arbitrary. So this is the basis. When you are persecuted, you can be granted refugee. Now India says, I'll grant you citizenship. Now the question is, you are now choosing it only, confining it to religion and not for rest of the, in terms of ethnic conflict, in terms of some other nationality issues. So why have you not considered the other aspects of this persecution, for which global standards answer? They give 2 answers to it. You must give a refugee status only for those who are not in a position to go back. That's a criteria. Otherwise, it will become a one-way traffic. So when international human rights values are drafted on these issues, they put the criteria very clearly. It's not enough if you are persecuted. You should not be in a position to go back. That's one threshold criteria. And 2, you cannot be posing a threat or a problem to the country which is trying to grant you refugee status. You cannot be a threat. If you are a threat, the same protocol says you should expel them. So there are 2 criteria. If you are a threat, you can be expelled. If you are capable of going back, because some ethnic issues, nationality issue will be cyclic, periodical. It will not be a permanent one where you can't go and live at all. The nation doesn't consider you as its citizen. It dumps you. Only such cases you can grant refugee status. And therefore, India has chosen that the criteria of religious persecution is something which is not cyclic or periodical. It is permanent. Whereas rest of the ethnic issues, rest of the ethnic conflicts, say I come from Tamil Nadu. We are all governed by the Sri Lankan Tamil issues, 30 years, but land is becoming peaceful and people are returning in large numbers. So they are all governed by the SOP rules, not by a grant of citizenship. So the division was made from the main cluster. One who cannot go back will be granted citizenship. And one who can go back need not be given even a refugee status beyond a point. You can give a temporary shelter. You can't be permanently enjoy refugee status in the country when normalcy restores. And therefore, the third category, see, what are the type of people who are all, who compose, who come into the basket called illegal migrants? 1, persecution in the name of religion where they can't go back. Other persecutions where they can go back. 3, people who are not governed or covered under this category at all. They have all migrated into India for economic prosperity. They are not governed by any international instrument. No human rights says that they should be given refugee status or citizenship status. Nobody can say that. No nation can take that burden. Therefore, this cluster, which is the largest packet, is not governed by any human rights values, even in terms of the global standards. So these are the three sections of people. And those who have come for economic prosperity cannot be considered even for a refugee status. Those other than persecution, other than religion, can go for a refugee status, and India is governed by the SOP refugee status. And now India has gone one step further to say those who are persecuted in the name of religion, who cannot go back, we will make you citizens. This is how this law has come over a period of time. Now tell us, how is this law bad? In what way you can consider this law as bad? So why people still raise issues? There are some 10 frequently asked questions. These are the questions that crop up in everybody's mind and also much talked. So let us understand those questions and see whether this law answers those questions. First question they ask, is it a threat to our own Muslim sisters and brothers who are all citizens of India? This Amendment Act does not interfere with any of the rights acquired by citizens of India. People will say about the registration certificate, NRC and all. I'm not talking about NRC today, I'm confining to CAA. And the easiest answer we can give is, a law can't be so arbitrary that by merely you don't show your ration card, then you will be thrown out. That's not how the law is designed. If you go and read into it, and that's why the hue and cry raised initially subsided over a period of time. That's more to do with procedures. Even if the procedures are arbitrary, it can always be regulated. But the principal question which one can be concerned about is, does it affect the citizenship rights of people of India, of all communities, especially Muslim brothers and sisters? Answer is, it does not affect. 2, what happened to children born out of illegal migrants? See how India has been benevolent for 54 years. From 1950 to 87, both can be illegal parents. 87 to 2004, one can be an illegal parent. So for 54 years, children born in India were granted citizenship rights. And to say that this should be kept as a non-ending elastic balloon, well, that is not human rights. Somebody will commit a mistake, and you should keep protecting and blessing that mistake is a human rights value. No international protocol says that. So it doesn't fall within that bucket. It's a second question which people raise. But third, people want to know the types of classification, which I narrated 5 minutes before. I'll just repeat it one more time for the sake of continuity. Persecution is a ground for grant of refugee status, and India has been granting refugee status. The only division now it has made is those types of persecution where people cannot return and people can return. Those who cannot return now are made citizens. Those who can return, if you apply, you will continue refugee status, and whenever you can return, then you should return. But the major chunk is people who don't fall under these two categories. Third category, who are all coming here only for economic prosperity. No law, no sovereign law, no international protocol or instruments give them any protection to say you should be refugees or citizens. These are the three types of classification. Now the fourth question they raise is Article 14. What is this? How can you divide people in the name of religion? The whole bandwidth of views through media and press is what? They're putting one stuck point everywhere. You are discriminating people between religions. And therefore, Indian Constitution, Article 14, it's not so. The discrimination is not based on religion. That's the core essential fact which we as citizens should understand. That discrimination is not on the ground of religion, it is on the ground of people persecuted in the name of religion. Those who are persecuted and those who are not persecuted. So where is the Article 14 issue here? How have we exceeded the credential, our secular credentials? In what manner? Therefore, somebody is persecuted in the name of religion, he becomes a persecuted person. Their religion doesn't matter. He is a persecuted individual. Somebody is not persecuted. Their religion doesn't matter. He is not a person who is persecuted. So persecuted individuals and non-persecuted individuals belong to two different classes. So how does Article 14 apply here? First of all, they immediately come back to say, fair enough, up to this we agree, but there are still persecuted even amongst the Muslim communities. Shias, Ahmadiyyas, and Rohingyas. So what is your answer for them? The answer appears to be simple when we read the global literature. All the three, Shias, Ahmadiyyas, and Rohingyas, they are not native Indians. They are not people of Indian origin. Even though this CAA doesn't anywhere say this 6 communities of Indian origin, but it can always defend, it's a defendable point to say, the threshold, because neighboring states, 3 class, it has all historical records to prove how this classification is certainly, let me not get into that at this point of time. So, but one point is all the 3, Shias, Ahmadiyyas, and the Rohingyas do not belong to India. Shias belong to Iran. Iran is their native land. And of course, 1/3 of Iraq has Shias. Yemen has 1/3 of Shias. And Indonesia, again, like Iran, has a large Shia population. These are the 4 major Muslim countries where Shias dominate. Otherwise, Sunnis dominate across the world. And all of us know history. The entire Arab nations form a league and fight with Iran because there has always been a conflict between Shias and Sunnis for years together. So this is the history of Shias. Then when it comes to Rohingyas, they are again native of Burma and Bangladesh, and there is enough and more track record which is available in public domain about the kinds of activities they have done in the last 40 years. And one of the threshold condition in international protocol in terms of human rights value is, if somebody can be a threat to the security of a nation, then even if he seeks for a refugee status, that state can decline for it. That's one of the considerations in the protocol itself. Now, when it comes to Ahmadiyyas, see, they are all people with Uzbek, we say Mongolian origin, Uzbek native, and Turkish Muslims, and settled in Pakistan, in Punjab province. This is how, if you read their ancestry, this is where they are traceable to. And they again have a conflict of view amongst the Muslim communities itself between the Shias and Sunnis. So, if they are persecuted, they can certainly come for the refugee status. How many have in India declared themselves to be of this origin? Because India is again a Sunni country in terms of its Muslim population. How many of them have come forward to say, I need a refugee status, I'm an Ahmadiyya, I'm a Shia? They're not. That's what statistics say so. So, because India is again a dominating Sunni nation in terms of its majority Muslim population. So this classification, using this classification as a shield to people who have come for economic exploitation to say it's violative of Article 14, well, it is several steps away. And from 1950, Supreme Court has been very clear. When it comes to fundamental rights, a foreigner is entitled only to the protection of Article 21. He is not entitled to any other protection. Therefore, you can't be invoking. An Indian cannot be pleading Article 14 for a foreigner and then make him into and bring him within Article 14 and then start saying that is violative of Article 14 and regularize the foreigner to be an Indian. The process is something so convoluted, and how legally permissible is something which needs to be tested. Therefore, this is what one can say when it comes to Article 14. Now they raise the ground of constitutional morality. Constitutional morality is a very big doctrine which on some other day we'll speak about it. But what you need to understand is, when something is constitutionally legal, can it be interpreted as constitutionally immoral? Then what happens? Morality will take over legality. So morality will declare a law which is legal to be illegal. Is this our intention of our constitution? So these questions again needs to be brought out, and it needs to be the conflict between constitutional legality and constitutional morality has to be synchronized at some point of time by the Honorable Supreme Court. Next, the question they raise is, okay, does India, what is the current position of citizenship in India? India still has naturalization process. As I said, last year, 2,900 people have been naturalized, which includes Muslims from Pakistan. You can go and verify the record. Now, therefore, the next question is, okay, so many state governments have passed legislations, passed resolutions, and saying that the CAA is bad, and we will and have instituted cases before the Supreme Court as a central state issue. Is it legally sustainable? That's one question which many people ask. In our very humble opinion, it may not be so, because when it comes to issues relating to national security and issues relating to citizenship, the right wholly and exclusively vests only with the Union of India. 8-judge bench in 1960 has said so, and it's reiterated subsequently in several rulings. So, see, we call it Tamil Nadu, we call it Karnataka. These are all divisions of convenience. No state legislature has territorial right of sovereignty over a state or its state borders. That's why the Constitution declares as India as Bharat, as a union of states. Therefore, the territorial sovereignty, integrity, security, and citizenship values are all subjects exclusively covered by the union list and to be governed by the union government. Therefore, how could there be a center state issue in this case? Is one issue again which may have to be resolved. Then, very importantly, we did this when we did a global research. We found out Egypt, Turkey, Syria, these are all countries which exports a lot of illegal migrants. Similarly, from Africa, the route appears to be through Libya. These are the 4 nations. We asked a very interesting question. This exodus, why should it go into Europe? And why does it go into the Arab nations, which are actually more wealthy, more resourceful, and capable of holding them? Because even in terms of fraternity, they may be the same. So we should understand they have all fenced their borders very carefully. The exodus doesn't go into Arab nations. The exodus happens only into Europe. And the statistics that reveal these are all available in public documents. 2014, hostilities were available in 7 countries. In 2015, it became 17. And in 2016, it has increased to 24 countries. This is the historical background because of exodus. Now, various European governments, including our United Nations Human Rights Commission, is interested to be participants in this Supreme Court matter in CAA. What is their locus standi? In what way we have not followed the so-called international guidelines, which other nations follow, which we don't. We are the only nation which has progressed the refugee status, which is recommended by these bodies, and we have progressed into a more advanced stage of grant of citizenship. We are the first nation to do that. We are recognizing the human rights value in them. And how does it become inhuman? It's a question which needs to be presented to the court. And remember, Izadeh Bhutto wrote a book, and this is documented in one of the government reports also, wherein he says, don't think Pakistan's claim is confined only to Kashmir. Our claims are also there for the northeastern states. Unless we claim that territory and make it part of East Pakistan, which conviction, which philosophy even the subsequent prime ministers to carry in their mind, unless we capture that, we will not have enough land mass, we will not have enough national resources to use for our nation. Therefore, it should rightfully belong only to East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. These are all statements authored by former prime ministers of these nations and found in the textbooks authored by them. The final question is, when 3 Supreme Court judgments have found 25 years we have actually led a life in inertia in not dealing with an issue. If a legislation is brought to regulate and to identify and deport, is it in the interest of India or is it anti-Indian legislation? Is something which each one of you as citizens should ruminate and take a call. I will close down my talk in the next 5 minutes with this appeal to you. If youth, I understand youth have joined this talk. In fact, I've been very cautious in my approach in this talk because matter is pending in the Supreme Court. So whatever is expressed is only a viewpoint at this moment. It has to be, court has to finally take a call and decide the issue. And one request I would make to the youth of India, because citizenship ultimately is something which is a matter of concern for you more than for us. You, your children, your progeny, your generations. So don't deal this issue from any emotional plank. I appeal to everybody, every citizen of this country. Don't deal this issue as an emotional issue. Understand the issue from its logical perspective. No nation in this world can afford, there is nothing called universal citizenship anywhere. Don't be carrying such lofty ideals as you think. We have not created the whole world into one nation. Such things have not emerged. So every nation takes care of its interest and its people. And today, the nations fall under 3 buckets, global nations. Nations which have secured the interest of their people, Russia, China, Arab nations, Australia. Nations where they have been, because of neoliberal lights, being flexible and do not know how to handle them now. And nations where this pressure has started to penetrate into countries like India. So who has to be vigilant? It is the future citizens who must be vigilant. You take a call. You want, when Supreme Court says 25 years you have lacked and this is what has happened to the nation, it has resulted in lands being taken away by them, resources being taken away by them. If you say, no, they should all be regularized, that's the call we as future citizens want to take. It's your bold call. So what are you doing in talking about this subject, in what manner, is something which you should first apply your mind to yourself. Think about what you're speaking about. Think about what you want. What this country of yours should need to address for yourself as its citizens. And in this, I think everybody should think alike as sisters and brothers. There can't be divided views. You can belong to a different religion, but citizenship and nationality is only one singular aspect. All of you should think from that perspective. And there, when you think as a citizen and think as a nation, where is the need to then bring religion there? So this is something which you need to basically have in mind when you take a call. See, traditions have taught us how to uphold dharma. Mahabharata is an example of how to win dharma finally from the clutches of adharma. There is nothing that our value systems, our history, our philosophy, our Puranas have left out. So there is a way to win dharma. Even if you want to win dharma, there is a way to win it. That's very important for youngsters like you, for many of you who are listening to this talk. Krishna very clearly says, if you want to succeed, dharma to succeed over adharma, the man who is pursuing that should give up ego, anger, aggression, and hatred. A mixture of ego into dharma will not produce a dharmic result. Dharma has its own ability to stand up and fight for itself and win. So if you want to be a tool in the hands of dharma, then all of you should remain united and think as one nation what we need to do in this law. After all, this law is to benefit people born in this country. So this message is what I thought I should leave it to young children finally. And I close this talk. Rig Veda, which is one of the first 4 Vedas of our nation, the concluding chapter 10 and the concluding verse of Rig Veda makes one beautiful prayer. I'll just read that and we'll play an audio for just 1 minute of what that mantra is. And with that, we will wind up this talk for the day. This is what is called as Aikyamatya Shuktam. It's also called as Samvana Shuktam. Sam is called common. Vana is called the Sankalpa. What should be the common Sankalpa of citizens of India in the interest of the nation? It says, Sangachatvam, Samvadatvam, Sambho Manamsi Janatam. Come together. Let there be oneness. Let us talk in one language. Let there be one mind for the society to progress into prosperity. Samana mantras savitas samani. Samanam manasaha sittametam. Samana mantra apimantra evaha. Samano avisha jihomi. May what you utter or pray resonate oneness. May thoughts that flow out of you be united and together. Samanive ahuti samana hridayam nivaha. Samanamastu o manaha evastu sagasa sati. May your sankalpa, may your goals, may your plans sprout out with a unified, united mind. May your unity bring happiness to everyone. Swaminathan, can you play that 1 minute?
Om Rigvediya Aikamatya Suktam Athava Samvanana Suktam. Samsamidyuvase vrishannagne vishva anyarya ilaspade samidhyase sano vasonyabhara sangachadhvam samvadadhvam samvomana amsijanata Deva bhagam yatha purve sanjanana upasate Samano mantras samitis samani samanam manasaha chittamesham Samanam mantram abhimantrayeva samanena vo havisha ajuhomi Samani va akotis samana hridayani vaha समानमस्तु वो मनो यथा वस्सु सहसति ॐ ॐ
Om Shanti, Om Shanti, Om Shanti. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Voice of Justice, and thank you, listeners, for being with us. Thank you so much. Ravi?
Video, please. Swaminathan, put me on video. Thank you, Venkatraman. Thank you, Venkatraman. Thank you for the wonderful speech. It has given very good insight into the background leading to the CAA. And one of the very important aspects which you covered was that this is in line with international protocols, especially UN Convention relating to status on refugees 1951, as well as the 1967 protocol. This is a very important aspect which has been lost sight of in the debate. And the second most important aspect which I find is that this does not take away the citizenship of any attempt by some of the people to divide the country on religious lines. On the basis that this is a legislation that attempts to take away the citizenship of some of the people on basis of religion has been dispelled. And I thank every one of you for having accepted our invitation and watched this program. Voice for Justice will be having similar such programs in the near future, and I invite every one of you to participate. I also request our young friends to take part in the activities of Voice for Justice. Please visit our website www.voiceforjustice.in to know much about the activities. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.